I want to touch briefly on the impacts of all these new family arrangements on the children who grew up in them. The day-to-day circumstances in which American children live are changing substantially as a result of these trends. More kids than ever are living with parents who are unmarried, divorced, separated, or never married. And the share who live in a traditional two-parent household is now down to about 65% of all U.S. kids. Here's what's most important to note about this. Number one, kids remain central to Americans' lives, no matter if the parents are in traditional or non-traditional family arrangements. Most Americans who don't have children say they want them someday, and parents do tend to report slightly higher life satisfaction than couples without children. The other big takeaway is that the emerging research suggests that being in a non-traditional family structure does not in any way negatively impact a child's well-being. The rise of non-traditional families has allowed more studies to be done on the outcomes for children. And what the research consistently shows is that what matters for children is the quality and stability of family life, not the structure. The glaring exception is children of single mothers, who, as I noted earlier, do experience greater challenges. We're going to drill down for a second here into the changing face of U.S. marriage. Marriage is changing pretty radically at the societal level. Here there are two fresh insights for you to remember. First, marriage is continuing to decline in numbers. Most Americans still marry at some point in their lives, but the share who are married at any given time is shrinking drastically. In 2008, just 52% of Americans were married, less than ever before. Why is this? Well, people are marrying later, they're staying married for shorter periods, and they're more often choosing cohabitation over marriage. There's a strong values component here. If you look at the chart, you'll see that nearly half of millennials and 40% of Gen Xers think that marriage is becoming obsolete. Even among people over 65, nearly a third think that marriage is becoming obsolete. So clearly there are some deep changes underway in the way people are viewing the institution of marriage. The second insight, and this one is more important for marketers, is that a marriage gap is emerging along socioeconomic lines as well as along generational and racial lines. In other words, marriage is going to look increasingly different going forward depending on who you are, how old you are, and your financial and educational status. The key driver behind this emerging marriage gap is the fact that three groups are not marrying in the numbers that would normally be expected of them. First is millennials, and I'll talk more about that in a second, blue-collar men, and African Americans. The reasons why they're not marrying vary, but for blue-collar men and African Americans, it's mainly economic. These two groups tend to give much higher priority to being financially stable as a precondition for marriage than, say, college grads do. Blacks and blue-collar men have been particularly hard hit by the recession, as you know, and this lack of financial security has helped push down their marriage rates in the last few years. So when the economy picks up steam, it's quite likely that we'll see at least a mini marriage boom among these two groups. But until that happens, it's unlikely. For millennials, the low marriage rates are driven mainly by values, and more about that in a minute. The flip side in this idea of a marriage gap is that we're seeing evidence that college grads are now far more likely to be in traditional married with kids arrangements than people with less education are. The share of college grads living with a spouse and one or more children in 2008 was 35% versus 23% of those without a degree. Let's talk briefly about cohabitation generally before we talked about cohabiting parents. But cohabitation overall is rising sharply in the U.S. The share of households headed by a cohabiting couple nearly doubled in the past 20 years to 5% of all American households, or a total of about a little over 6 million households. Cohabitation is actually most prevalent among Hispanics. 8% of all Hispanic American households are now headed by a cohabiting couple, compared to 5% of white and black households. An interesting sub-trend among cohabitants is what researchers are calling committed unmarrieds. This is a growing niche of people who intend to never marry. They have all the trappings of a traditional married family, the house, the kids, the intention to stay together. They just don't have the license. So they act more like married couples than they act like other cohabitants. For example, they're more likely to purchase big-ticket durable goods, and they're more likely to be parents as well. So this emerging population makes an interesting topic for further research. When it comes to marriage, African Americans stand out in the data in several ways. They're less likely to be married than any other demographic group. As I said earlier, at the moment this seems to be partly because they tend to place a higher premium on being financially secure before marriage. So as the jobs picture improves, African Americans may see a marriage surge. Because they're less likely to be married, they're also more likely than other groups to be single parents. And another difference is that, interestingly, Black Americans' acceptance of interracial marriage seems to be on the decline. It was quite a bit lower in 2009 than in 2001, dropping from 80% who said they'd accept a family member marrying someone of a different race to 72%. We explore all of these phenomena more deeply in our series of Global Lifestyles Briefs on Marriage, so I encourage you to check those out. Millennials get their own slide here because, partly because of their influence on the past and partly because of their influence on the future. Regarding the past, millennials are actually the main group that has been driving down U.S. marriage rates. In 2010, a mere 22% of millennials were married, much lower than any other living generation at the age that millennials are now. Michael and Morley will talk about the millennials in depth, but briefly, their unusual marriage behavior seems to be driven largely by generational values that lead them to feel less urgency to start their own families than previous generations did at this age. However, it's also important to note that all of this may change in the near future. Most millennials actually say that they do hope to marry someday. And as more and more leave behind their so-called odyssey years, the years that they've spent exploring different careers and lifestyles, the indications are that they will start marrying in greater numbers. What's extremely interesting to be aware of and I think address much further, and by the way, we have a brief called Millennials and Marriage that goes into this in much more depth. As millennials start forming families, they could substantially change the way marriage and family looks in the U.S. 4 particular points to note here. We expect that many millennials will cohabit before or instead of marrying. Second, this may also include having more children without marriage. Thirdly, millennial fathers will be very fully involved in child rearing, and millennial mothers will demand this of them, being independent and career-oriented as they are. And finally, rather than seeking work-life balance, as we've seen for the past decade or so with Gen X, millennials will likely demand unprecedented levels of work-life blending in order to enable the levels of family closeness that they want. Finally, we're going to talk briefly about what you might call the re-extended family. This is a sharp reversal of a 4-decade trend toward the generations living independently of each other. As of the last couple of years, about 45% of U.S. households now include 2 or more adult generations, or in a very tiny share, grandparents and grandchildren living together with no parent present. This means that these days about 49 million Americans are living in a multi-generational household. For example, nearly 2/3 of boomer women are providing housing for their adult children. The recession definitely intensified this trend since the numbers spiked between 2006 and 2008. But beyond the recession, there's good reason to think that multi-generational families are back to stay, and this is because of demographic drivers. Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and millennials are all oriented to close intergenerational relationships, and all of them have very large youth cohorts that are going to start forming their own families in the next decade. So these young families can be expected to push the trend further, for example, by moving in with their parents or inviting their elderly parents or grandparents to live with them. In closing, I'd like to take a second to remind everyone that although U.S. families are changing drastically, they remain absolutely central to Americans' lifestyles. 75% of Americans say that family is both the most important and the most satisfying aspect of their lives. Most people report wanting to form families by whatever definition they attach to that term, and most people want to have kids at some point in their lives. This increased diversity in how people construct and define their families certainly means more complexity for companies that are trying to connect with U.S. consumers, but it also means significant new opportunities to identify and address new needs. We're moving more toward a world where family life will be recognized not as a monolithic experience, but as one characterized by huge variety, which demands a much more fine-grained approach by companies, maybe even a long-tail approach, as I suggested earlier. So it's crucial for companies to study and understand these changes that are underway. Thank you so much for your attention, and Chris, I'm going to pass the mic back to you now.